good day to everyone. My name is Herawati Sudoyo, Chair of the Medical Science Commission of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences. On behalf of the organizers, the S20 Secretariat, and the Indonesian Academy of Sciences, and the Asian Development Bank, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the final webinar in the S20 webinar series. The webinar is part of the Indonesian presidency of the G20 in 2022. We are now in the second year of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic has helped people to recognize the importance of health promotion, healthcare, and pandemic preparedness. It also showed has linkage with climate change and the role of technology. We recognize the two defining challenges of the 2020s and beyond, and both will require technology, evidence, research, and knowledge to action in ways that are more democratic, effective, and efficient. To understand more about the role of research and how to translate it to actual policies and practices, we are pleased to have a group of distinguished speakers and panelists to share their thoughts with us on the topic of health, climate change, and technology, three very important and complex issues. Without further ado, please let me turn the floor over to Professor Satrio Sumantri Brojonegoro, the President of the Indonesia Academy of Sciences and Chair of the S20. Professor Satrio, the floor is yours.
Good morning to colleagues from Europe, and good afternoon to colleagues from Asia, honorable speakers and panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to all of you and participants. Thank you for your presence and support in the series of S20 High-Level Policy International Webinar today at June 15, 2022. We deliver a theme of health, climate change, and technology. Our appreciation to the speakers, colleagues, and attendants for their concerns in this important theme of this webinar, who come from reputable organizations such as Health Ministry of Indonesia, the World Health Organization, Indonesian Academy of Sciences, Bio and Tech Turkey, and Public Health Foundation of India. My sincere thankful also to our S20 collaborating partners and co-chairs of S20, Asian Development Bank, National Research Agency in Indonesia, the new capital of Indonesia, University of Indonesia, University of Gadjah Mada, UNESCO, G20 working groups and engagement groups, and the organizing committee for their support and dedicated work in the process of Science 20 activities. Recover Together, Recover Stronger is the main theme of G20 2022. The goal is to develop a concrete action plan for a green, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable global economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic, with the spirit that there is no country left behind. The intersection of health, climate change, and technology could be the defining challenge of our lifetimes. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the slow-moving climate change crisis, and the fast-moving technology landscape are the three large and separate themes. The convergence of these three themes will require ambitious political will and strong policymaking supported by robust evidence and appropriate judgment. The rich experience of speakers should enable to provide powerful insights about how we can navigate this intersection. The insights from this seminar will inform the S20 communique for deliberation at the G20 and will support the conceptualization of regional knowledge and innovation hub to strengthen the connection between knowledge to policy to practice. This communique is important because G20 plays a crucial role in knowledge generation and use. The knowledge sharing agendas of G20 countries could be aligned better with research that is in the interest of all global citizens. There are several reasons for why the G20 is crucial to international research and collaboration. First one, G20 is arguably the leading international forum outside the United Nations framework. Through its capacity, G20 convenes the world's largest advanced and emerging economies. It is in the position to support the global recovery efforts. For example, G20 accounts for 80% of world GDP, 75% of global trade, and 60% of world population. Second, many low or middle income countries depend on international research and scientific collaboration because they do not invest sufficiently in a national science agenda, causing their science output to remain relatively lower. Third one, the diversity of G20 countries provide moral weight and opportunities for inclusive decision making. Therefore, it is important to discuss and define how G20 and the world's leading economies can use their expertise and resources to address the world's present and future challenges. G20 should foster countries' ability to use science and technology in creating evidence to make decisions in uncertainty conditions, where quantitative judgment alone will not be sufficiently guide national policymaking. Policies and pathways should be carried on to building global health architecture, related risks, and other possible threats in the future. Recommendations and actions should be proposed to aim at promoting a more shared, inclusive, and resilient growth for all. Therefore, the collaborative efforts and action that governments made through international community should be beneficial in achieving stronger recovery and ensuring resilience for all. G20 needs to strengthen cooperation to overcome the pandemic, climate change, and enhance science and technology's contribution to the quality of life improvement. My thankful once again. I hope you have a good and fruitful discussion for the betterment of future global society. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Satrio, for sharing your thought on the importance of G20 in knowledge generation and practice. Now we turn to our two keynote speakers who will speak for 10 minutes each. Our first keynote speaker is Mr. Kunta Wibawa Dasanugraha, the Secretary General of the Ministry of Health, representing Mr. Budi Gunadi Sadikin, the Minister of Health. Mr. Kunta Wibawa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is both an honor and a pleasure for me to be a part of this important meeting. Allow me to extend my profound appreciation to the Science 20 that has put together this high-level policy international webinar to address issues related to health, climate change, and technology. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, it is clear that our life cannot be separated from science and technology. Science and technology has become an integral part of our lives since the dawn of civilization. As we can experience today, we could gather and engage in this important event virtually, all due to the advance of science and technology. The role of science and technology is becoming increasingly important during the period of uncertain times, such as COVID-19 pandemic. Pandemic has emphasized the role of the development and utilization of science and technology in health policy making. During the pandemic, we relied on science-based and evidence-based policy making to come up with the most effective strategies to control the cases. We at the Ministry of Health of Republic of Indonesia has developed and utilized the advance of technology in health sector, such as an integrated COVID-19 big data system, a surveillance mobile application, or usually we call Peduli Lindungi, artificial intelligence and machine learning to monitor the COVID-19 situation, vaccination coverage, and the availability of essential medical countermeasures to inform health policy. Therefore, we believe that this approach should be maintained to help government in decision making and to strengthen global health architecture to better prepare and respond to future health challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, as you are all aware, the Indonesian G20 presidency put a strengthened global health architecture high on our agenda. In order to achieve this overarching goal, the Health Working Group has developed 3 health priority issues, including harmonizing global health protocol standards, building global health system resilience, and expanding global manufacturing and research hubs for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. We understand that achieving this overarching goal requires an in-depth multi-sectoral understanding, including through technology and knowledge sharing across different sectors. Since the future challenges we face are complex and could be influenced by others, such as climate change and technology. Therefore, they should not be treated as isolated entities, and we have to ensure that they are mutually reinforcing. The linkage between health, climate change, and technology is unavoidable. Failure in dealing with climate change will somehow have a ripple effect on the human health and well-being. On the other hand, science and technology could play an instrumental role in creating a healthy environment, which will in turn contribute favorable to human health and well-being. Furthermore, digital health is becoming increasingly inseparable from our daily lives, particularly in health service delivery. It is imperative that we harness its potential effectively to achieve a better health and well-being for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, I am confident that we will be able to benefit from the outcome of this seminar, which has been designed to inform this S20 communique. The outcome of this meeting could be provide an added value to G20 deliberation, particularly in Health Working Group and other related working groups, through the in-depth consideration on the various aspects on science and technology, and the implication in human health and well-being. Health policymakers must consider the full range of functions that must be strengthened in order to increase climate resilience through health sector building blocks. In closing, allow me to wish you a very productive meeting and look forward to working closely with all of you achieve our common goals in creating a better global health underpinned by science and technology. Thank you. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Bapak Kunto Wibowo, the Secretary General of Ministry of Health, for sharing your thought on the Indonesian experience in generating and using evidence in health. Now we turn to second keynote speaker, Dr. Sumiya Swaminathan. Dr. Sumiya is the first Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization, appointed in 2019. She is a pediatrician from India and accomplished researcher on tuberculosis and HIV. She was previously Secretary to the Government of India for Health Research and DG of the Indonesian Council of Medical Research. Dr. Sumiya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to share a few thoughts during this high-level S20 event. And I think we all have high expectations of the Indonesian presidency in moving some of the priority areas that were described by the previous speaker and in which the WHO has been quite deeply involved in all of the three working groups. So I want to just spend the next 9.5 minutes or so describing why science and technology and the use of science, the use of data and the use of evidence have become so critical. I think none of us can deny the fact that in the last 2.5 years, science, technology, innovation, these are words that we've heard repeatedly, but also they've played such an important role, both starting from the understanding of the clinical features of the disease, the clinical trials that were done early in the pandemic with repurposed drugs, including the Solidarity trial, which was done in over 30 countries. Again, it's a good example of a global collaboration and a project that was designed to answer questions quickly, efficiently, and effectively, and generate the best possible evidence in the least amount of time so that countries could act on it. And the way that these trials were run was completely through individual level participation. We have hundreds of collaborators from around the world, but most importantly, the findings quickly moved into the treatment guidelines, and so we knew which drugs were effective and which were not effective and should not be used in the treatment of COVID. We then went on to see the emergence and the development of not just one or two, but several new vaccines based on several different platforms, like the mRNA platform, the viral vector platforms, the inactivated vaccines, which are, older technology, but also some of the subunit proteins. And today we still have innovations coming in the form of nasally administered vaccines, aerosolized vaccines, and ultimately we are looking, of course, for a pan-coronavirus vaccine that will be effective against all variants and all future variants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And eventually, the goal is to get to a pan-coronavirus vaccine, which is effective not just against SARS-CoV-2, but SARS-CoV-1, as well as other beta coronaviruses. So I think the field of research got a huge acceleration, a huge stimulus, and a huge amount of interest. And also the common man, the common person who was reading about these developments, I think got a much better understanding of science and the role it plays in society today. For the first time, we had clinical trials being discussed, front page news, TV channels, etc. So hopefully this would have generated interest in the younger generation also to take science as a career. But at the same time, there were challenges. It wasn't all easy. And while the science was moving ahead very rapidly, and the WHO did play a very important role in coordinating the global scientific endeavor, and I think this is relevant because the G20 I think, is debating on how the leadership of science within the G20 countries could play an important role, a leading role, when faced with a global emergency, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's climate change and its impact on health, or whether it is something like antimicrobial resistance. These are all problems, global problems. They need a coordinated global solution. But before I move on, I should mention that while science and scientists played an absolutely exemplary role, what did not work as well, of course, was the equity in the access to the products which came out of all of this innovation, starting from personal protective equipment early in the pandemic to vaccines and drugs and diagnostics. We've seen that the rate at which diagnostics are used in low-income countries is about 100 times less than the rate at which they're used in high-income countries. And similarly, we still are faced with the situation of less than 20% coverage of primary vaccination in low-income countries compared to about 65 to 70% in the remaining countries. And so whatever we do for the future, whatever scientific collaborations we build, we have to keep in mind that equity has to be at the heart of these networks or these new partnerships, and that people, wherever they live, must have access to the products if they are at risk of the disease. The second challenge, I think, is around the application of scientific knowledge and evidence into policy. And we know that this is not straightforward, that it's not a straight line, that evidence and data doesn't often lead to the kind of policy that one would expect. But policymakers are faced with many, many competing priorities. And therefore, policymaking needs to be rethought. Again, at the global level, of course, it is different because at the WHO and the science division in particular, we put in place several mechanisms that enabled us to rapidly access data, to rapidly synthesize the data, to keep on updating our guidelines. We came up with the concept of living guidelines, which means that every time there was a new clinical trial or a new finding, we updated our treatment recommendations. And in fact, that's something we're going to do now across all of the other technical departments of WHO. We set up huge global networks, collaboratives for evidence synthesis. We opened up databases so that people from all over the world could have a look at all of the scientific literature. In fact, journals did the same. They made COVID articles open access. So a lot was done to make information and knowledge available. But how was that used at the national level? That actually varied from country to country, and different countries set up different mechanisms to take all of that evidence and data and transform it into guidelines. And some did better than others. So I think there's lessons to be learned from the kind of systems that were put in place by countries. And I think those countries where there was a multidisciplinary group of experts who were discussing and debating the policies that should be implemented, because on the one hand, you have the data and the evidence. On the other hand, you have the societal aspects, the challenges, which are unique for every country, the societal contexts, the economic contexts, the impact that it might have on people, some of the legal implications of some of the tools that were being used on privacy and confidentiality. All of these would need to be considered holistically before policy is made. And therefore, for the future, particularly for complex areas like climate change, where there is growing evidence of huge impacts of climate change on health, particularly things like air pollution, like the kind of heat waves and other weather malfunctions that we are seeing, enormous effect on people both in the short term and the long term, not to speak of the impact on nutrition, both of climate change, but also of the war and many other conflicts around the world that are increasing food security for a number of people. And we know that leads to malnutrition. Malnutrition then often leads to increased susceptibility, both to communicable and non-communicable diseases. So I think setting up both the global mechanisms and structures, then the regional ones or groupings like the S20 and the G20, where certain topics which could sometimes be politically sensitive or which are otherwise not, maybe black and white, but need different nuances in order to be interpreted. We need mechanisms And the three important things that these mechanisms need to be transparent, they need to be inclusive, and they also need to have this multidisciplinary approach. We've also set up very recently a behavioral insights unit at WHO because we realized that many of the public health actions that we were taking needed behavior change, including vaccine acceptance, including the wearing of masks and the compliance with other public health actions. And therefore, without understanding people's behavior, it is important, and often this area is neglected. So behavioral science, behavioral insights, very important part of public health and policy implementation. And then I would say that we need to look ahead. So we've set up a foresight function, but essentially we want to work with our member states, countries to see what are those innovations, those technological and scientific advances, which in the next 5 or 10 years are going to have big impacts on people's health, and which might have not only huge potential for health, but also some risks which need to be mitigated. And artificial intelligence is a good example of a new technology which has a lot of benefits, but also needs to be discussed again with ethics in mind, with equity in mind, and it needs a good regulatory system. And this is something that's still not very strong globally, and something that probably the G20, the S20 could look at. What are those new technologies like genome editing, which like the CRISPR and Cas9 technology. So there are a list of things which we can anticipate we will be using more and more of, but at the same time, are there ethical, social, legal implications or environmental implications that actually need to be discussed and debated, and regulatory frameworks put in place so that these technologies can be used for the good of people without causing either expected or unexpected harms, because technology is neutral, but the way we use it, of course, varies. And this is where I think a collective action, just like we're thinking about these interoperable health records, which is again one of the initiatives of the Indonesian presidency. Similarly, trying to think about regulatory systems for some of these big technological changes and advances that are coming through would, I think, go a long way in bringing both transparency but also increasing trust in the technology. Because finally, I just want to say before I finish that something unexpected we faced was the infodemic, where there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation and a lot of rumors and myths being spread, especially through social media platforms. Again, WHO did partner with many of the technology companies in order to minimize misinformation and increase the amount of credible information that's available to people. But this is likely to continue to pose a challenge for us, for our populations, with wide access now to the internet and to social media platforms. Again, something governments need to think about, not just how to regulate these social media platforms, but also how to use them effectively, minimizing the potential to cause a lot of mistrust and misinformation. It could be COVID today, but it could also be climate change, and it could be other aspects of health tomorrow. So with that, I will stop my presentation once again with many thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sumiya, for sharing your thought on the WHO experience in helping countries use evidence better. And we are all agree that equity is the heart of collaboration in S20 as well as part of the G20. Now we turn to a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Susan Roth. Dr. Roth is the advisor of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department and also the Chief of Knowledge Management in the Asian Development Bank. Dr. Roth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Hera. It's a great pleasure to moderate this panel today. It's really at the heart of what I'm doing in the last, I think, 30 years of my career. And that is really to understand the intersection between health, technology, and climate. And I think what we've heard from Dr. Sumiya, I always really love listening to her, how she is able to connect all the dots of science, behavior, and of course, the lessons learned from the pandemic. What we want to discuss today is, while we all see technology as the beacon of hope to manage the pandemic, and we have lessons learned from that, and we see it as the beacon of hope to manage all the things that are coming with climate change, and to look at mitigation and to look at adaptation solutions, we know that we do have problems to actually roll out and scale up technology innovations. We have problems to have equal access to science and evidence to make these technologies attractive. We have issues of funding, obviously, and we have a huge challenge to fund the science agenda that is required to address the health challenges and the climate change challenges, which are all connected. At the end, it's about the human consequence and the people, and to fund these solutions. So it's fantastic to have this panel here today. We have a very esteemed panel. We have Professor Dr. Akmal Taha. He represents the Indonesian Academy of Science. Thank you for being here today. And it's a great pleasure to have my two country people here. That's Dr. Ugur Sahin and Dr. Eslem Terezi. Both are the co-founders of BioNTech. Wonderful to have you here. And then we have Professor Srinath Reddy. He's the president of the Public Health Foundation of India. And then we are very happy that our host is also joining here, our MC, Professor Hera Sodoya, who's the chair of the Medical Science Commission of the Indonesian Academy of Science. So a very esteemed group of people, and would love to go directly into one of our first questions. I'd also like to invite the audience, please, to drop any comments you have or any questions you have in the chat box. We will come back to them and make sure all your questions and comments are answered. So, Professor Taha, the first question I have for you is, we spoke a lot, or we heard already from Dr. Sumiya, that it's really important to democratize access to science and access to evidence. And we maybe need a better G20 mechanism and a better knowledge architecture to fund that and to drive this forward. What is your experience from the perspective as a fellow of the National Academy of Science? How do you define a science agenda for a country like Indonesia? And what do you think needs to change or improve?
Thank you very much, Susan. Indonesia is applying the top-down and bottom-up approach in its research agenda setting. This agenda is designed with holistic approach across sectors based on research focus areas. Top-down means that the research agenda is set by the government according to the government priorities, and other stakeholders might have research priorities, and those stakeholders are invited to co-create the research agenda. Researchers in the public sphere are then expected to propose their research topics. Bottom-up approach is done by observing the potential strengths and resources which refer to real data as the foundations. The focus of this agenda in Indonesia is then explained in detail as national research priority for the 5 years. This national priority is set to generate innovative research products within the coming 5 years. Based on my observation and experience, Indonesia tried to balance between the backing winners or areas with proven strength with backing challenges to breed innovation and supporting the new dynamics. Indonesia research agenda consists of 9 focus, 30 themes, 47 topics, and 49 products. This data shows that Indonesia research agenda is taking the broad absorption approach instead of few specific priority. The preference of priority leads to availability of resources. With small research and development expenditure, the government holds the autonomy to regulate and direct funding allocation. It seems collaboration with domestic stakeholders and international sources is must to achieve the objectives of the agenda. But fortunately, in the last 5 years, a significant development of open science movement is apparent, which create impact particularly for Indonesia academia. It showed the advancement of open science concept and implementation that can be adopted to increase scientific impact. More initiative and technology have been introduced to make science more open, transparent, and inclusive. within open science and technology development, Indonesia academics should not rely on their old perception of research outputs and impact indicators. We believe that open science will foster democratizing evidence, particularly through collaboration among G20 countries and even globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dar. So maybe an additional question. So what we hear is you're saying we need to have more priorities so that resources are more like focused and channeled. But I mean, we see the big changes in the Indonesia research agenda, but to be honest, we don't see much IP applications, or we don't see a lot of research publications from Indonesia coming out globally. So what needs to change there so that more of Indonesian scientists can participate in the global research agenda?
Yes, of course. The first challenge for our research improvement agenda in our country is actually of course, the very important is the small amount of the expenditures in research and development. And the second, because of that, then the government try to make corporations with the private sector, with particularly with the international resources. But most of the resources now, I think, should focus on how to have a talent pool for the research, because this is the very important. So this is still a big problem in Indonesia, because now the governments makes only one research institute or research agency, a national research agency, and one of the very important program is how to pool all the talent in one, and so we can working more efficiently and more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I hear talent is one, and the other one is more funding for the national research agenda. So, and you mentioned the role of the private sector. I think that's a good way to introduce our two biotech founders. And I don't know who wants to speak first, Dr. Sain or Dr. Terezi. So maybe you come in here. And I think the question we have for you is, what would have helped your research if the pandemic hadn't happened, right? I mean, the pandemic, of course, was also a huge opportunity for you. You were able to actually create a lot of revenue that you can now pour into your really interesting public health research that is happening right now. And maybe you can share a few details of that. But would you have liked to have more support from government-supported science, a science agenda, for example, and maybe, also from a global G20 mechanism?
When it comes from our perspective to democratizing evidence, data, scientific insights, I think there are 3 levels we need to discuss. One level is the dissemination of data and scientific insights in order to foster technological developments based on that. I think in that regard, we are already in a good position. We have a peer-reviewed publication system. Data which is generated is accessible to scientists all over the world, can be discussed and critically reviewed by scientists all over the world, so that this system really works and has improved actually in the context of the pandemic, because preprint servers which make data and scientific insights even more transparent have been, for example, implemented. So this is the dissemination of data level. The second level is the generation of data. And there, I think we need more democratization. Namely, what we observe is that data for many regions and populations, which should also equally benefit from actions, for example, in terms of improvement of health, which are motivated and are supported by such data, is not available. In order to illustrate this with one example from our area of expertise, if we, for example, want to develop an immune therapy against, let's say, colorectal cancer, there are regions where, from which we have data in terms of understanding the incidence, the biology, the histology, the immunology of this cancer, and can adapt our clinical development programs for innovative therapies accordingly. But there are also regions where we do not have this information, which makes it difficult to, according to the equality spirit, also develop and make accessible our immune therapies for these regions. So that would be an area where we would want to see more structured and well-funded research in order to characterize the respective diseases in those regions as well, so that we and others can act upon it in terms of development of new therapies or diagnostics. And there is, last but not least, a third level. Data and scientific insights are valuable if you can extract actions from them in order to address global problems in health, for example, climate. And in order to execute, you need the respective structures and frameworks. And these are given in some regions, but in others not. Again, an example from our area of expertise, if we, for example, want to develop immune therapies, there are very standardized and well-defined ways to do this in terms of regulatory frameworks, policies, structures of clinical development in some regions, but others not. And this aspect has also to be democratized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Maybe to your point on democratizing access to the research, democratizing access to data, and then democratizing access to kind of the regulatory environment, to equalize, right, the regulatory environment in a way. Maybe the other question is democratizing opportunities for talent. Can you maybe share some examples for that? Because I know that your collaboration, right, with Rwanda and Singapore, you are also looking at building actually local capabilities.
Ugo, do you want to take this?
Yes, maybe I can take this. So we already know that for example, Africa has the highest rate of young people, yeah, and therefore we see a great chance, yeah, particularly for novel technologies, manufacturing, mRNA, product development, AI, machine learning, and that there is in principle enough people who could be eligible for learning and applying these technologies. And therefore, the way how we would like to implement our innovations, we are planning to develop manufacturing solutions which can be implemented in any region on the planet based on cloning of technologies and using digitalization for rapid adaptation of processes. But we still need local talent in the place. Yeah? And here we want to collaborate with local universities, with the WHO hub, yeah, for the training of individuals to learn the basic requirements of, for example, quality assessments of products, of manufacturing, but also of using digital solutions to ensure that we have regardless where an mRNA vaccine is produced, the same quality assured. And this is a huge chance because, as Dr. Sumiya shared in her view, it is about being inclusive. That means we believe sustainability of solutions and innovation transfer could only work if the people and if the shareholders on the other side are not only involved at the end but from the very beginning.
I think what you said is very important, and probably that's a role for G20 to, bring more equality to, or bridge the gap between producers of science technology and the users. And by doing that, ensure, number one, that these solutions are sustainable, that policies and regulatory environments are adapted and can be anticipated already. And of course, that we build the right kind of workforce and skills to advance technology applications in countries. So I'll come back to you in the second round. Thank you very much. I think now it would be very interesting to hear from Professor Reddy with his long experience in research and policy making, to maybe share a bit about what you think is needed to bring really research to action, to implement it in, for example, in the health sector.
I always believed at the Public Health Foundation of India that policy and science must be closely interlinked, because science is sterile if it lacks social relevance, and policy will crumble on clay feet if it does not stand on the firm foundation of robust science. Therefore, we believe that knowledge must be translated to action, that action must demonstrate impact, but that impact must also be equitably distributed. It should not only benefit a few sections of the people. Therefore, research must generate evidence-informed, context-relevant, resource-optimizing, equity-promoting, culturally compatible recommendations for policy and practice. Therefore, researchers need to address relevant questions of high priority to the health system and to the people's needs, to provide problem-solving and barrier-breaking solutions. And this requires multidisciplinary knowledge. You cannot have it only from biological sciences, or only from social sciences, or only from economic sciences, or only from quantitative sciences, or only from management sciences. You need all of them to be brought together, because you require that kind of a knowledge creation for multi-sectoral application, because health has many determinants and many arenas of action. Enlightened policy requires scientific credibility, financial feasibility, operational steerability, and political viability. Again, multidisciplinary research has to support that. And in particular, we need to undertake and facilitate implementation research, not just to create knowledge, but to see how it is translated into impactful action, reaching the intended beneficiaries of society, be it the public or the patients. And we must involve multiple stakeholders in this process, from policymakers and health system managers to communities and private sector, with the academia playing an enabling role to support each of these, to tap into their aspirations and translate that into impactful research. And then we must help the policymakers to prioritize the interventions based on burden of disease estimates, the potential impact of interventions, the cost and cost effectiveness, as well as equity considerations. Unless we bring all of them to the table, the policymaker is not sufficiently enabled to recognize the value of the research products that we produce. Therefore, it's absolutely important that even while pursuing open-ended research, we need to definitely ensure that we are aiming at problem-solving implementation research, which can actually be transformational.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is Professor Reddy. This was quite powerful. I think what you brought in here is really the ability to have a moral framework to decide what kind of technologies should be adopted and for whom. I mean, obviously, the pandemic can lead to, we could have a very controversial and interesting debate here if the solutions are beneficial for the majority of the population that we are offering, and what the unintended consequences are of some of the policies of the last 2 years. But let's not go into this discussion. Let's look forward. So on this challenge of moral framework and bringing it together, one question I have here is the need to communicate research very well, right? You need to communicate research very well and communicate new technologies. And maybe we'll start again with Professor Taher on what is your experience? What kind of skills does the new generation of researchers need to really communicate their research to policymakers and to the public so that we have faster adoption?
Yes, thank you. Let me give you time to tell about our experience in the Indonesian Academy of Science. When we started in 2016 to 2018, we try to have, we call it the evidence summit. Is actually try to collect all of evidence and then try to translate the evidence to policy for the maternal mortality problems. The evidence summit is begin with the process called an evidence synthesis, where it's purely scientific activity involving key universities in Indonesia. The summit appraised 7,800 literature, determined 20 protocols of focal questions, and produced 71 eligible questions. Among these many incidents, the summit found only one high quality of evidence. This is the problem. But once this process concluded, we counted that there were a total of 79 stakeholders, 16 governments, 16 higher education institutions, 10 professional organizations, 5 donor groups, 17 NGOs, and 4 research institutions. All these stakeholders have engaged with the evidence summit through focus group discussion and field assessments. As concluding phase of the summit, this effort then present policy recommendation to the various sector stakeholders, particularly, of course, the Ministry of Health. In 2 years, Ministry of Health adopt 30% of the recommendation and made into ministerial decrees. This show how evidence policymaking is possible to implement in Indonesia. The key point that I want to raise is actually that we involve the ordinary citizen right from the beginning, from starting from the evidence collecting evidence synthesis. I think this is much more, the communication is much more easier afterwards. And then we, of course, use evidence scientific findings were communicated through various channels: traditional media, online media, public lecture on primary healthcare, which was aired in YouTube, and also through public discussion and consultation with gathered scientists, policymakers, civil society representatives, the media, and ordinary citizen in one virtual room. But one is a very important point is actually that one from primary healthcare is the important role of community health workers as an interface between health provider and ordinary citizen. Through them, we can communicate evidence from research more easily. And as an additional point, I would like to highlight that communicating science to ordinary citizen does not end at the public consultation. It must expand to execution and delivery to those citizens for impact and sustaining behavior change to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Important point here that you mentioned. You have to involve all stakeholders from the beginning, especially the citizens and the users, to understand their perspective and to understand, how they understand the technology, right? And how you can engage in a dialogue. I assume that Dr. Sai and Dr. Teresis, you have a lot of examples on that, right? From doing at that time probably niche research in 2019 to then becoming a mainstream, right, technology by 2022. What were the challenges that you faced when you had to communicate the benefits of mRNA technology to the general public and to non-scientists? What did you learn, and what kind of capabilities do you need?
This was indeed.
Please go ahead. I can afterwards add my part.
Yeah. This was indeed an interesting experience, because before the pandemic, mRNA was only known by experts, and even not by all experts, but by dedicated scientists in the field. And our task was to communicate our technology. It was the first basic communication about how mRNA works, and this is not directly related to our vaccine, but what is messenger RNA. It was a communication about how science works, and how clinical development works, and how evidence generation for a vaccine related to generation of safety data and efficacy data works. So the basic principles we had to be communicated to create a foundation for trust and understanding about the results that we generated. The way how we communicated our data and the principles that we used were that every time when we generated new data, we created a press release summarizing the data, and directly after the press release, we prepared a publication which we have uploaded on a preprint server. The press release had the function that we could make our new findings accessible to the public, to the journalists, and of course also to the experts. And the publication on a preprint server had the function to really visualize and make our data and the raw data very clear. Yeah? And this helped us because we initiated a communication about our data and about science, but the communication continued in the public and was driven by experts. And I believe this is the best way how communication should work, because as a private institution, of course, we have a conflict of interest in praising our technology or praising our product, and we will not do it. But if we make the data available, and make the explanations available, so the experts and the trusted experts in the field, and the journalists can do their job, and reflect about the data, whether they are convincing, what are the concerns. So this is the way how we continue to work on. It is important that we heard about vaccine skepticism. We heard about trust. That every communication should also be a communication about not only what we know, but what we don't know. Because this is important. That this aspect of not knowing things and communicating in a proper manner, provides also an understanding in the population that science is never finished, but is an ongoing process.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. These are very important points, right? If we apply them to the climate change conversation, which is completely new territory. If we think about, how do we adapt infrastructure? How do we adapt urban living spaces, cities? And also, what's the best way to mitigate CO2 emissions while we all want to decarbonize economies? This is new territory. So I think there we have to have this science-based conversation that, we don't know yet. We don't have all the answers. We have to continuously learn, but the conversation has to be supported. It has to be led by scientists and not by politicians. I think that's also what I hear from you. Dr. Teresi, would you like to add something? Yeah.
What Ugo said was actually very comprehensive. I just want to highlight again what you pointed out, how important it is that the discussion is led and accompanied by experts. You know, the zeitgeist, because of the availability of all the data and information in the publicly, and its discussion in social media and so on, has created a bit a situation that every one of us thinks that the fact that all the data is at the tip of our fingers, that we are experts of everything. And we have to go back to appreciating what experts can help us to analyze. And in that regard, I think it's very important to also generate structures which allow experts in the respective fields to speak up, to help to guess the data, to also help to describe the impact and the meaning that data has. For example, with regard to climate change, it is still not sufficiently available what the situation of the current sort of climate aspects is. And for this, we really need the experts to describe this in a way that everyone in their language, in the language they understand, are informed.
Yes, thank you. So the role of a science-based approach to policy and to adopting new technology, I think, is essential. This should go in the communique. And we also got already some questions from the chat room, and I think one of those is very adequate for Dr. Reddy. Dr. Reddy or Professor Reddy, there's one question that just came in, and that is, and maybe you can probably have your good perspectives on that. And that is, we hear from several speakers promoting collaborative research, but what is not discussed is that there's actually a lot of competition. So for newcomers into research, it is actually, especially also from middle or lower income countries, it's very difficult to get into collaborative research arrangements. Professor Reddy, do you have any reflections on that from your experience in India?
Well, while research is seen sometimes mistakenly as a purely individual enterprise, we recognize that it is actually a team effort, whether within institutions or across institutions, and now, as COVID has shown, across countries as well. Health is a complex adaptive system in which there are multiple areas that keep changing, and we need to really find what the right questions to be addressed at each stage are, and how to find the right solutions which can adapt to the situation. And therefore, it is absolutely important that we bring our best brains and the greatest energy together. And therefore, research cannot be a selfish enterprise. It has to be an enterprise which involves many researchers who collaborate and bring their talent together in order to benefit all of humanity, but especially, of course, the communities that they are closely associated with and are serving. And therefore, the whole idea of collaboration and mentorship becomes important. Senior researchers must mentor younger researchers, and researchers must tend to work together to solve many problems. And therefore, it is absolutely essential that we build what we can call a T-shaped individuals, in which there are many researchers who will actually develop a lot of in-depth expertise in certain area, but they must also have familiarity and sensitivity to other disciplines so that they can actually collaborate as necessary when necessary. Therefore, we cannot develop siloed scientists. We need to develop people who have certainly a great deal of expertise in certain areas, but have the breadth of understanding and the generosity of spirit to work with others. And that is something that we must build into our own educational process and into our research establishments. And therefore, even the grant making process must bring in, firstly, multiple disciplines together and multiple generation of scientists together as a team science approach.
Thank you, Professor Reddy. I think what you are bringing up here is the need for G20 countries to actually have more collaborative frameworks and probably also more funding for those researchers who are coming into research new, or coming from countries where maybe research isn't that prominent yet. And I know, Dr. Hera, I didn't warn you about this question, but I think for you, having a lot of experience in personalized healthcare, the intersection of technology, I wonder if you, Dr. Hera, can share if it was difficult for you and your team to actually access national collaborations on research, and what you think is required to make that easier for the next generation of researchers, especially in middle-income countries.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yeah, I think if we are talking about primary healthcare, we also should not forgotten about the personalized healthcare. That's what I meant. But in terms of the G20 and S20 in the G20, we are actually lucky that there is a meeting. The second health working group meeting recently held in Lombok. It is a 3-day meeting that drafted a policy brief on the One Health concept. And most of the concepts is containing issues that actually has been discussed in this webinar as well. So you mentioned that we need finance, and the importance of having a joint finance to the World Health is a very important in terms to respond to fragility of the global health system. And also the cooperation or the collaboration between countries, meaning that collaboration between scientists and between research institutions is very, very important. Because we understand most that some collaboration is not equal. Need capacity building, not helicopter research that one comes and quickly goes without even coming again. So that kind of, I think, research, that kind of collaboration, that it's needed in our countries. And communication to multiple stakeholders. That's something that has to be strengthened. It's also becoming a problem in the personalized healthcare because people or policymakers still do not understand the importance of the new technology and new knowledge to the future disease management. I think beside whatever that we actually suffered during the pandemics, the year 2020 and beyond should not be neglected. And we know that they all have different methods and communication as well. Communication on research results, especially to some who are science illiterate. So I think communication to public, communication even to all of the scientific community who do not still understand where the science goes, and policymakers is necessary. And we are lucky actually that during that the G20 health leaders, there are several points that already being mentioned. That first of all is that there are 3 addresses that optimizing the collaboration between the G20 member. The first one is actually mobilizing financial resources. The second one is managing funding efficiently, of course, during the pandemic on the prevention, preparedness, therapeutics, and diagnostic. So all of those points that we have discussed in the panel is actually included. And the second one is actually optimizing genomic surveillance and promoting the trusted data sharing. And that's very important. So we are not talking about this pandemic only, but about how the genomic or different kind of omics actually helping us for a new disease management in the future. So I think with that, we could actually put all of those issues and communicate to the G20 health leaders. Thank you, Susan. I think that's all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Hera. I mean, great points on number one, mindset shift towards more personalized medicine and probably also personalized to community and population needs. The second one on faster, anticipating new kinds of regulatory environments that we need to make personalized solutions possible. So I think that's a great question for Dr. Terezzi to maybe answer. If you now, look forward, what kind of regulatory support would you like to see from governments that leads to a lot faster adoption of new technologies that are in the interest of public health?
I think what is important is the attitude of cooperatively solving the challenge of adapting our current frameworks in the regulatory space, but also in the policy space, to these new types of potential healthcare products. We are, for example, developing truly personalized cancer vaccines, which are on demand, customized to each and every patient's unique tumor. And we learned the lesson that it is very important to be in a continuous conversation and dialogue with the regulators and have the openness to really discuss with this use case very specifically how can we solve the next challenge in this development from science to the patient's bedside for this specific product. I think the most important aspect is really this openness and this understanding that it is about solving this challenge which comes with innovative and personalized and precise therapies together.
To that point, because we want to make this nexus between health and climate, right? In these discussions with regulators and with policymakers, are they all anticipating and agree we will see a lot more infectious diseases, a lot more cancer because of climate change, temperature changes, and of course, environmental pollutions? Is that already part of the discussion? And maybe we'll start with Professor Taher. Any views on that or observations? More urgency, basically. Maybe we need to fix the, we can't hear you right now. Who would like to answer? Maybe Professor, yes? Oh, now we can hear you, yes.
Maybe later, Susan.
Okay, good. Okay, so we'll come back to you later. So, Professor Reddy, any observations on that. Do you see that the health agenda has gained urgency, especially among regulators and policymakers, because they realize we will see a lot more health issues? Is it pandemics, infectious diseases, cancers, non-communicable diseases, which are also linked to the climate change, impacts of climate change, and of course the change of lifestyles that come with it?
Policymakers who have to take the decisions and act upon them usually like to have some impact in fairly short time frame. Therefore, if we project the potential impact as somewhat medium term or long term, they may listen, they may adopt political resolutions, but are unlikely to follow up with concrete actions immediately. Therefore, while we do sketch out what the medium term and long term impacts are likely to be and how intergenerational equity is going to be undermined, I think we have to really press them to understand what is happening even in the short term. And both in climate change and other challenges that we see, whether it's pandemics or air pollution, there are enough number of changes that are happening even now, which are clearly demonstrable as having a very severe adverse impact on people and on national economies. And therefore, we have to tell them that unless you take these actions, you're going to have a serious problem. The agrarian crisis in the world, which climate change is now creating, is something that people are feeling in terms of food price inflation. That is very clear and demonstrable. And the number of other instances of health disorders because of mounting air pollution, all of that is clearly demonstrable. And therefore, I think we do need to build up that evidence of both short-term as well as medium and long-term consequences of inaction. So the cost of inaction has to be documented. And then along with the price of inaction, we have to demonstrate the price of action. That is, if you take action, this is likely to be the beneficial impact immediately, and communicate to the people also, because the people are the voters. And if they feel convinced, they will put pressure on the government as well to continue to take action. Therefore, the academia who produce these kind of research results cannot only confide them to the governments, but must engage other elements of society so that a popular movement is built up for change in policy which is required.
Right. Let's bring in one of the questions from the audience in the meantime. And one of the questions is, yes, we are talking a lot about collaboration and multidisciplinary approaches, but how can we really make that happen? What is required to bring multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to research in countries? Because we all know we sit in our little research silos. So maybe Dr. Taher, if you want to answer that question, how can you, from the perspective of the National Academy for Science, how can we support more collaborative interdisciplinary research?
I want to answer from other perspectives, Susan. It is from the regulation, from the regulations, because we know that the fast adoption of research new technology needs some change of regulations. Addressing the future of regulation, we must start with at least two caveats. The first is evidence suggests that impact of regulation on business innovation has almost always been negative. That regulation has delayed and even prevented innovation in many areas. And the second, it's crucial to internalize that when we make an attempt to design the future, we cannot start by what is available to us today and assume that the same conditions remain in the futures. From this caveat, I think we have to see the future design of regulation evolves around these 5 areas. The first is adaptive regulations. The shift from regulate and forget to a response, iterative approach. Adaptive approach to regulation rely more on trial and error than to co-design of regulation and standards. They also faster feedback loops. And the second is the regulatory needs regulatory sandbox. Prototype and test new approach by creating sandboxes and accelerators. An accelerating trend for regulatory agency is creation of accelerators and sandboxes, in which they partner with private companies and entrepreneurs to experiment with new technologies environment that foster innovations. The role of a regulator is no longer just a regulator. It's more of a partner in bringing safe and as effective technologies to the table for people to have that high evidence in those technologies. The third, I think this is very important in terms of collaborative regulations. Align regulation nationally and internationally by engaging a broader set of players across the ecosystem. This is an ecosystem approach when multiple regulators from different nations collaborate with one another, with those being regulated, can encourage innovation while protecting consumers from potential fraud of safety concerns. In this approach, private standard setting bodies and self-regulatory organizations also have key roles to play in facilitating collaboration between innovators and regulators. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Taher. I think this was very clear and also kind of reflects what Dr. Terezzi shared with us. There has to be a dialogue between regulator and innovators and new companies, and we see this now happening, especially in probably more mature regulatory environments. But this is where we need now more capacity development, especially in less mature regulatory environments, and maybe that's a G20 agenda that needs to be carried forward. Maybe now back to this question that we had earlier, and I understand that Dr. Terezzi, your audio works now again. So this question about collaboration between disciplines, how do you think this can happen more and easier?
The collaboration between disciplines is very important, and in our field we actually see that it is working fine. You can also see that in publications, in peer-reviewed journals, that in most of publications you can clearly see that disciplines have to work together to indeed produce meaningful data, which then can be used for solving health problems, for example. I think what is important to further foster and expedite such cooperation are frameworks which incentivize that different disciplines come together and work jointly on use cases. This is one aspect. And another aspect is it's not only about bringing disciplines together, it's also about educating experts who, with their expertise, marry different disciplines in sort of one mixed skill set. And for this, we would need structured programs which set up such educational pathways.
Yeah, I think that is very interesting and very relevant, especially for emerging economies, where we are now talking about reforming education curricula, investing a lot more in knowledge economies. So this brings me to this question, maybe the last question before we go to the last round for Dr. Sahin, and that is, do you think we need missions, like the government or G20 should set missions? The mission to let's eliminate cancer. I mean, this is a very ambitious mission, so that there would be more collaborative efforts that is, funded, targeted, and driven by these missions.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Yes. I think we need missions. We need financing, but we have also need blueprint how to work with each other. So we have heard now from various speakers, and that this must be teamwork, and the kind of challenges for which we would like to develop solutions are like electrical circuits. So in the electrical circuit you have a power, yeah, and then you hope that this power helps to light up a lamp, yeah. But what we understand is that until the lamp is lighting up, there are a lot of gaps, yeah. So that means an individual part solution and closing one gap is not sufficient to come to an effective result. So that means if governments come up with missions, we have really to understand in a holistic manner how the challenge can be solved by collaboration of partners in different fields. Yeah, so this is the access to development of innovation. This is the access to innovation. This is the ecosystem, the establishment of policies, the establishment of regulation, and the ensuring that the technology could be supplied, the information, the communication with public. These are different tasks, and we have to understand that collaboration is not only just that everyone is willing to do something, but collaboration is also has to be seen as a project, yeah, where we need to close the gaps to make the impact of individual innovation really accessible for public. And that is something, a second piece. So that means a mission, but also a strategy, how we can ensure that the solution reaches the people.
Thank you. I think this was a fantastic summary. And hopefully from the last 2 years and the collaborations during the pandemic, we will develop some blueprints for collaboration, for better regulation, better policy making. And that's, I think, that's why I work in knowledge management. I think that's the key to the future. We need to manage this knowledge across disciplines, understand roadblocks, understand red tapes in governments, and ensure there are implementation pathways and roadblocks are diminished or reduced. And I know that Dr. Hera, you wanted to add something. You texted me that you want to have an intervention here. Maybe you want to add to this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susan. I just want to share the activity that we had actually on the Asia Pacific region, that we, with the Future Proven Healthcare and supported by Roche, is initiated a consortium of countries across the Asia Pacific to accelerate progress towards a healthcare of the future. Says, for example, by tracking and measuring progress towards more sustainable, personalized, integrated, and digital health system. For that, 11 countries gathered just to help to learn from each other our weakness and our strength. And we would like to avoid the mistake of the past. We would like to create optimized and sustainable system. And we produced the so-called personalized health index in the Asia Pacific. So from there, we learn on the first vital sign that we have to actually study the health information available in the country, the health services that could actually support the health ecosystem, the policy context. Do we have the policy framework, partnership people, and drivers who would facilitate the healthcare? And the fourth one is the technology. Do we have the technology to be able to actually together 11 countries do the same things and actually collaborate equally? So there are several, of course, limitation, consideration. So we know that the scope, the conceptual limitation, the problem on the rapidly evolving healthcare context, and others. So how do you actually want to accelerate and realize this vision? Say, for example, first one is incentivizing more comprehensive generation and collection of data. Secondly, developing strategies with accompanying, I think Dr. Reddy said, implementation plans, establishing system for monitoring, development, evaluation process. Third one, increasing the use of real world evidence to inform decision making, because they would like to have something which is in the real world. Improving digital health literacy among citizens, and now we are using it during pandemic. Working towards models that's for all mixed technology, generated data generation, implementing the health in all policy, approach to policy maker. So of course, it's allocating funding, developing infrastructure and services. Those kind of white paper is presented to all of the countries, to the policymakers. And we hope that, and then together maybe we can do that to build the ecosystem in the country. I think that's all that I would like to share, Susan.
Thank you. So I think an excellent example of the need for sub-regional, sub-regional and regional collaboration mechanisms to set agendas. And this links to what Dr. Zain said on creating blueprints to implement new technologies, to take it up. And that requires collaboration across governments. And of course, the private sector too. So I know we are at the top of the hour, but we have, of course, one last question for you, because you need to make sure this communiqué is clear and clearly informed by your views. And that is, what would you like this communiqué to mention? What's kind of your key message for G20, if you can summarize that in 1 or 2 words? And maybe Professor Tahir, if we can start with you.
With the word of evidence informed policy making, because I think it's very, very important for push for G20 countries to move in coherent alignment to achieve desired global impact, especially after catastrophic like pandemic. It will be beneficial if G20 countries can learn from evidence-informed policymaking process, drawing from the one example, Susan. This is studies by the Stutliff and Court, where the ancient countries, countries in Africa, some countries in Africa are allowed to have a toolkit which serves as a guideline that triggers systemic approach for improving evidence in policymaking process in country levels. The implementation of this guideline was tried in several African countries. But based on this example, I think it's only logical to ask that a similar effort can actually be done by G20 countries. The outcome might be a guideline or other product that supports evidence-informed policymaking to be done systematically within at least the G20 countries. That's from my opinion, Susan.
Yeah, no, excellent point. And this links very well with Dr. Sumiya's intervention. As you might know, there was actually the Summit for Evidence to Policy Pathways last year, hosted by WHO. Again, unfortunately, that's a work unit that is underfunded in WHO and hasn't received any new funding. So again, a call to G20 countries to actually fund more evidence to policy mechanisms, ecosystems, and capacity development in countries. I think that's important. Okay, let's hear from Dr. Sahin. What would you like G20 countries to take up, and especially to support more innovative technology companies to address issues which are in the interest of the whole population?
Yeah, just to repeat what we already discussed, I think the most important is really a vision, a mission statement for addressing long-term problems, and also long-term funding and long-term generation of projects, and that can run for 10 or 15 years, because the challenges that we are facing are not challenges that can be addressed in 1 or 2 years. These are long-term challenges, and we need a structure and solutions to enable long-term research and implementation of results.
Yeah, I think this is excellent. As some of you might know, G20 doesn't have a clear vision and mission statement. In the past, was mainly to support global financial architecture. So maybe one thing we can put in this communique is to call for mission and mission-driven approaches of G20 and financing that goes beyond one cycle, but leads then to projects, research, and technology that serve the whole population, the whole global population. Dr. Terezzi, anything you would like to give to the communique of the G20 country for the G20 conversation?
I fully endorse Ugo's recommendation, and I did not only hear the mission statement part. I think what we need also to highlight is this long-term plan. So a catchphrase could be a 20-year plan for G20 missions. Another aspect I would like to add is that in our area of expertise, what we observe is that when it comes to translating science to survival, to health, to cure, the interaction between the public and private domain. Public being those who do academic science and evidence generation, those who are responsible for regulatory pathways and for policy making and implementation into, for example, clinical practice, and private means those who have to execute the innovation development, that at these interfaces are frictions which make it complicated to ensure that science can serve health. And I would like to ask and recommend that there is special attention paid to those interfaces, because here we need really a cooperation between public and private sectors.
Thank you very much. And there's one provocative question from the audience that fits exactly into your comment, that we have to manage these intersections. And that is basically about how can we make science and evidence public goods and avoid that the benefits and profits are often privatized or monopolized by high-income countries, right? How do we make sure the profits that are made, also, of course, by research or pharmaceutical companies like yours, are going back to benefit the public? Any thoughts that you have there?
By implementing an understanding that this is about public, the interaction and the relation between the public and private sector should be one of shared social responsibility, and by incentivizing innovators who develop and have profits to reinvest in further amplifying and expediting their innovation process, also in other areas. I think this is important because the bottleneck is indeed, we have great science, we have great innovation, but the bottleneck is financing and structuring this path of bringing this innovation towards to a place where it can benefit the public, and this needs to be incentivized.
Excellent point. So what we need for the G20 countries is to change incentives so that there are incentives for the private sector to actually do research and find technologies that are in the interest of the public and that serve public good. So it's about financing, in a way, public goods research and technology solutions. I think this is a great way to continue. Thank you very much. To continue with Professor Reddy, because I'm sure you have a lot to share on that topic. And maybe then also please summarize what you would like the G20 conversations to take on from our panel today?
Thank you. I think governments must use their great convening power to bring together different stakeholders and break the current circle of distrust and replace it with a circle of trust. At the moment, the government doesn't trust the civil society doesn't trust the private sector doesn't trust the government. We cannot build a healthy society on that basis of distrust. We need to build better trust through, of course, accountable mechanisms and clear-cut deliverables. Therefore, I think what is really required is for the government to bring together all the stakeholders, clearly state what the identified priorities are, try and develop social contract mechanisms in which the benefits will accrue to all sections of the people across all countries if possible, and also back it up with financial investment, particularly with advanced market commitments for products which are likely to be beneficial, because many innovations may actually flounder because after the initial investment, they don't know how to actually take it to the market. So advanced market commitments are an important instrument which governments must deploy, of course, responsibly. I believe governments have a great role in building these partnerships and making them perform with accountability.
Now, excellent points. Advanced market commitments based on a mission that's identified by government, and then technology providers, innovators can come in and know that their technology, when it works, is actually adopted and scaled, and there's financing available. Very, very important point. So definitely a lesson learned from the pandemic, and also so relevant for climate, right? If we know certain new technologies that help with reducing emissions or adaptation are financed, then of course private sector will invest in it and take it up. Thank you. So Professor Hera, you now have the opportunity to be the last speaker for this panel conversation. What would you like the G20 conversation to take away from our panel today?
I think I would like to actually collect all of the comments from all of the panelists, because one and each other is actually kind of like supporting. So vision and mission is the most important one. And I seconded Dr. Sahin and Dr. Tureji for that. A funding commitment, although G20 is most concentrating on funding, we need a long-term funding commitment to be able to work and to be able to do some activation or collaboration. What we need is an equal, trusted collaboration between middle-income country and the rest. So I think that's what I would like to say about all of this. And Dr. Reddy is actually giving the last and final comment, which is will make all of the comments from other panelists complete. Thank you, Susan.
Okay, thank you very much. I do hope you all enjoyed this conversation. We thank all of you for participating. I know you're all very busy experts, and we do hope we stay in touch on the conversation, especially as the presidency is handed over to India next year. I know that, of course, Germany as a G7 country plays an important role anyway in these conversations. So let's hope also there comes more support for the G20 research agenda here. And so thank you very much all. Thank you to the audience. I'm now handing over again to Professor Hera to come to the last section of our program today.
Thank you, Dr. Roth, Susan, for moderating the panel so effectively. And thank you to all of the panelists for sharing your thought and insight. Now we turn to Professor David Mulyono for a wrap-up. Professor Mulyono is a fellow of the Medical Science Commission in the Indonesian Academy of Sciences. Prof. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Herawati, and thank you to the S20 Secretariat and the Asian Development Bank for having me in this interesting webinar. In this webinar, we have heard from distinguished speakers and panelists sharing their thoughts on evidence, health, climate change, and technology. Allow me to wrap up with a title, Toward Regional Knowledge and Innovation Ecosystem. The COVID pandemic has serious impacts on the ability of many nations to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030. However, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that the 2030 agenda could be reached with the push scenario, with research as the main tool, because research provides transformative choices to put countries back on track towards achieving the vision of the 2030 agenda. The recent World Health Assembly 75 that was held at the end of May 2022, 2 weeks ago, also emphasized that the necessity for continuing research to enable action to end the current crisis and embark on a road to higher well-being and ultimately prosperity and environmental sustainability. Several themes from our speakers are clear, and I would divide into 5 points. The first is there are gaps in research to action pathway. Throughout COVID, actually, we have seen two structural gaps. The first is there is insufficient relevant evidence generated from research. This requires understanding of the research needs, the development of suitable capacities and infrastructures, and better applicability of the research that are attained through better support, better opportunities for research, including funding. And the second gap is the process of moving from knowledge to policy and practice is too slow. And this requires better organized research to action pathways. It has been discussed in many aspects. The second point is there should be a joint research agenda with adequate funding and support. The world's research communities should create a long-term joint research agenda to meet critical research needs by both top-down and bottom-up research initiatives and maximize efforts. For health and medicine, this can be conducted in the context of community, family, and personalized healthcare that are translatable and delivered in the framework of primary healthcare, as stated by previous speakers. There should be more innovations, funding, and collaboration that also include private and public sectors. And in this regard, G20 should see research as a public good and an essential investment, not as an expense. The third point, there should be enabling environments. I would like to emphasize enabling environment worldwide. The world's research community must attempt to democratize evidence generation, democratize access to new technologies, remove distrust, and communicate information to the public and policymakers. This is also related to the control and management of the impacts of the climate change. Research and technologies and their collaboration must be inclusive and equitable across the global north and south to resolve the deep disparities between and within countries. The fourth point, there should be a robust knowledge to action ecosystem. Research alone is not enough. It must be supported by a regulatory, political, economic, and social environment that allow the rapid and robust implementation of research. It includes that was recently discussed, generation of data that can be utilized together. To be beneficial, science and action should be closely linked. One thing that was emphasized in our discussion includes the inclusion of capacity to communicate research results, including generation of publications, which are weak in most of countries in our region. The fifth or the last point, multiple stakeholders must be involved. Generating and utilizing evidence that involves multiple stakeholders, including scientists and researchers, universities, technical institutes, government agencies, start-up incubators and accelerators, regulatory agencies, and venture capital companies, and last but not least, the people, being the most important stakeholder as the center of the application of research result. So this is the importance of the people itself, because we discussed about the other stakeholders. All stakeholders must work together to build capacity and a faster research to action pathway and the application to the general public. Ladies and gentlemen, there are these 5 points are essential to achieve the health tech transformation in Indonesia. One of them is the development of health tech ecosystem, which is highlighted in the blueprint of digital health tech transformation strategy 2024 that was launched on December 16th, 2021 last year. To conclude, interchanges between scientists and the public are the ultimate objective of research to overcome our global problem. This pandemic should be regarded as an opportunity and a driving force for changes to recover and to become stronger together through mobilization of researchers and learned societies, and secondly, capacity building and empowerment that lead to accelerating sustainable development in all fields, particularly in health. Thank you very much. I return this to the MC or Professor Herawati.
Thank you, Professor David, for wrapping up the webinar for us and summarizing the key points. Now we turn to Professor Sofia Mubarika for closing remarks. Professor Sofia is a fellow of the Medical Science Commission in the Indonesian Academy of Sciences and is the chair of Task Force 1 of the S20 Secretariat. Professor Rika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Herawati. And thank you to the S20 Secretariat and the Asian Development Bank for inviting me to deliver these closing remarks. And thank you very much for all speakers and panelists that we have had great discussion and also very comprehensive thought that have been we enjoy this afternoon. It is very clear that there are gaps in research, evidence, and research to action. But it is also clear that there are best practices and recommendations to fill these gaps that we have heard from many speakers. What we need now is the political will to take the necessary action to fill these gaps. We have heard that we need to have a blueprint collaboration regional as well as sub-regional. We need to have a one health approach according to the WHO and UNESCO recommendation, but also in the omics approach, how to make the personalized healthcare happen. And all of this note and excellent insight have been taken note by the S20 Secretariat, and hope that all the insight and recommendation will be incorporated into the communique to G20 leaders at the appropriate setting and timing. We thank you again for your participation, and we wish you all the best. And I turn back to you, to Professor Herawati. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sofia, for your closing remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we conclude this webinar for the S20 this year as part of Indonesia's presidency of the G20 in 2022. Please visit our website for current and incoming news of S20. We will organize 2 incoming webinars. On the 30th of June on clean air and climate co-benefits, and on the 18th August 2022 on climate change and health. Thank you once again to all speakers and panelists and audience members, and we wish you all good health. Goodbye and see you again in the next webinar.